안녕하십니까. 저는 프리드리히 에버트재단 한국사무소 소장 크리스토프 폴만입니다. 만나서 반갑습니다. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Nohe-chan, for introducing me so kindly. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be invited here by such a distinguished group from the Progressive Justice Party to talk about German and European social democracy. Thank you very much for your interest in this matter, and I hope we can, after my short lecture, a fruitful debate. As Mr. Nohe-chan has already pointed out, this is a special year for German-Korean relations because we are celebrating 130 years of diplomatic relations, at the same time 50 years of the agreement between the Republic of Korea and Germany on the sending nurses and migrant workers, minors, to Germany in the early 60s. So two things to celebrate, and this coincides with a renewed interest in Germany, as we can feel since the late last year there is a growing interest in the German social market economy and the social welfare state of Germany and small and medium companies and so on. So I'm very glad about this, and I hope my short lecture can maybe contribute to this as well. German and European social democracy, that is not something new. This is a very old and traditional movement already. So when I'm talking about history, challenges, perspectives, and potential for innovation today of German and European social democracy, then this takes place against the backdrop of more than 150 years of party existence, in the case of the German SPD, for example, which just celebrated its 150th birthday 1 month ago in Leipzig in Germany. So first of all, I would like to talk about the history of social democracy before I point out some basic values and programmatic items which might be of interest to you, and then I will talk about current challenges and debates in German and European social democracy. As I said, in the mid of the 19th century, so around 150 years ago, social democratic organizations were founded in Germany, Great Britain, and other European countries, and their objectives were to politicize and to organize industrial workers who were suffering in the times of Manchester capitalism, who were working under very precarious conditions. And the idea was, together with trade unions, to create a countervailing force against the very strong coalition of entrepreneurs, factory owners on the one hand, monarchic governments on the other hand, and the workers, the poor ones, on the other hand. So the foundation of social democratic organizations and trade unions at that time was a reaction to the mass poverty, to the deprivation of workers living and working under these conditions. And this solidarity with the underprivileged in society, with those who have fewer rights and opportunities, still shapes the program and ideas of social democracy today, although of course the parties have changed since then. There's one very decisive thing to mention, and this is, I think, also very important in the Korean context, where you still have a strong legacy of anti-communism, that there is a crucial difference between social democracy and Marxism, because social democrats have never pursued a revolutionary approach towards changing the current state of affairs, but a reformist one, which means that they chose a way of gradual reform and of political empowerment and co-determination of workers, instead of opting for a revolutionary approach like the Marxist movements have done. So social democratic parties were always in favor of changing capitalism, of giving more rights to the workers and to women, of equalizing the opportunities in a society, but on a gradual way, in a non-violent fashion, in line with, let's say, the constitution of the current times and so on. Although they had to overcome many obstacles, because many people were certainly against giving more powers to workers, social democratic parties were able to accumulate more power and influence at the end of the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, social democratic parties became, in many countries, the most powerful parties, especially in the 60s and 70s of the last century. This was possible because social democratic parties had changed after the Second World War. For example, the SPD, with the famous Godesberg program of 1959, opened itself up for new societal groups. So social democratic parties tried to become attractive for other constituencies than industrial workers, like academics, like professionals, lawyers, for example, and especially also for women, who became more and more influential in the 1960s as they could participate more in university education and so on. The climax, if you want to say, the height of influence and of power of European social democracy was arguably reached in the 1960s and 70s, because at that time in Europe there was high economic growth, there was a broad social consensus which enabled social democratic governments to significantly increase the welfare state, to improve access to higher education for all groups of society, and also to regulate the economy, so to create a kind of regulated capitalism in Europe, which benefited both the employer side's business, but also workers and ordinary people on the other hand. But then, for a number of reasons, we had the so-called neoliberal turn at the end of the 70s, early 80s, which put a lot of pressure not only on social democracy but also on welfare systems of regulated capitalism. And what started was the age of deregulation, of privatization and so on, conducted especially by Margaret Thatcher and President Reagan in the US, but then also kind of spilling over to many other European countries, including Germany, which kind of maybe came to an end at the global financial and economic crisis 2008 and still ongoing. But this was a time when social democrats were clearly in the defensive. As a reaction, we had the so-called policies of the third way, which were mainly developed in Great Britain under Tony Blair, but also adopted by former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder in Germany and the Red-Green coalition we had. And this essentially meant modernizing social democracy on the one hand, but also accepting certain core assumptions of neoliberalism, like, for example, one has to reduce the welfare state, one has to be always fit for global competition and so on. And this created some growth in the first years after it was adopted, but it also had a lot of costs, especially social polarization increased, like you know in Korea as well, after the so-called IMF crisis. And then since 2003, 2004, I think one can say what followed was a crisis of social democracy in Europe, because people lost trust and confidence in social democratic parties. And now we are still in the situation today of a certain crisis and a lot of fundamental debate going on in European social democracy, how we can get out of it. Okay, this was a brief historical overview. I would now like to come to basic values and basic programmatic features of social democracy. They have always been, since more than 150 years ago, three basic values of social democracy: freedom, justice, and solidarity. And these three values are not in a hierarchical order. but they have to go together. Otherwise, Social Democrats think their objectives of a fair and just society cannot be achieved. So I would like to talk a bit about each of these basic values. First of all, freedom. In the social democratic context, freedom on the one hand has a liberal connotation, which also liberal political people would adopt, which means a person should have a certain degree of individual freedom as much as possible in order to pursue his or her happiness. So this American idea of pursuit of happiness is also something Social Democrats would underline on the one hand, and on the other hand, people should be free from indiscriminate infringements or violations of civil rights by the state. But, and this is important for Social Democrats, freedom has limits. Freedom is not without limits because it also has to be compatible with the basic value of justice. This means two things. First of all, the freedom one person enjoys must not lead to the strong reduction of the freedom of another person. So I cannot pursue my freedom if others, for that reason, have to have a big reduction in their freedom. And the second thing is that it is the role of the state, together with societal forces, to make sure that there is a public order which is as just and fair as possible. So what means justice in essence is that all people should have the opportunity to realize their life chances or their life opportunities, and not just some few people who may be privileged for one reason or the other. And if people are not able to realize their life chances on their own, the government and society have a duty to help them. And this last point, helping others who are not able to do it for themselves, leads to the third basic value, solidarity, which, if a society is a solidary one, it means that it strengthens societal cohesion and it encourages commitment of the individual for its compatriots, for the other members of society, and this all together makes for a human society in the social democratic concept. So these three basic values connect social democracy with one other very important force in society, the trade unions. So although social democracy and trade unions in Europe and also in Germany are not the same, and they sometimes have different interests, nevertheless there is a common bond which connects them, and this is this kind of emancipatory understanding of social advancement, that one, in the end, one fights for the underprivileged ones in society out of these three basic values. This is what connects and still connects social democracy and trade unions. So this was an overview about basic values, and now I would like to switch to more current affairs of social democracy. So what is the state of social democracy in Europe and Germany today, and what are the main challenges and also maybe opportunities for social democracy and social democratic parties nowadays? Yeah. There's one basic or fundamental challenge in Europe which not only social democratic parties but all parties and also other mass organizations like trade unions are confronted with. This is a certain crisis of the so-called catch-all parties, of the big parties we have in Germany and other European countries. And this is not only related to the parties themselves, but also to kind of secular trends in Europe of increasing differentiation of societies. Societies become more heterogeneous and have more societal milieus. And we also have a continuing individualization. So more and more people are hesitant to join big organizations like big parties, big trade unions and so on. They prefer to join small NGOs or neighborhood initiatives, something like that, on a rather short time horizon only, And an increasingly smaller number of people really wants to be part of a big organization for lifetime. But this is the concept of social democracy up to now, and so this is a challenge we have to cope with. In addition to this general challenge, social democratic parties face a challenge coming out of this third way policies, which I already described. So this lack of trust, which still is visible in social democratic parties, especially in Germany, but also in Sweden or in France or in Great Britain, this still has to be overcome. And this will probably take some more time, and it will need some more debate and some more intense renewal of social democratic parties until this legacy of neoliberalism within social democracy will be overcome. And because of this perceived crisis situation of European social democracy, there have been many debates in the last 10 years, which have started after social democratic parties lost many elections. And I would like to talk a bit about these debates now and about the process of renewal of German and European social democracy. And these debates were certainly also triggered by the financial and economic crisis of 2008-2009, which in essence is also, of course, a crisis of deregulation of especially financial capitalism. And so out of this context, social democrats are debating how we can renew our economies, how we can develop the economies from an industrial resource using economy to more ecological ones, not only on the national level but also within Europe and globally, and also how we can develop a new relationship between market and state after the state has given too much room for market forces in the last 30 years. Another area European social democrats are concerned about is the development of the European Union. You are all reading every day the reports about the European debt crisis, and social democrats in Europe want to reform the European Union. They want to have further deeper integration and a strong regulation of capital and of banks, of the banking system in Europe, stronger than is done currently by the current governments. And what European social democrats also want is a so-called social Europe. Nowadays, the EU is a market-driven integration model, and European social democrats want to change it and want to increase social security also within the European Union and not only in certain member states. So everybody knows that one needs a renewal, both programmatic and organizational, of social democracy, but one also has to say there is no magic recipe for renewal. So the debate is still ongoing, how we can beat, how we can kind of break this still ongoing dominance of neoliberal policy concepts in Europe. And the idea is not to develop certain policies in some areas, like for example tax policy or welfare policy and so on, but how can social democrats again define a social democratic discourse, a narrative which is convincing in a normative way and which might be appealing to a majority of people. This is what is currently done in the social democratic debate in Europe. And one idea, or one major debate one can say, is the so-called good society debate in European social democracy, which is about the topic, how should a good society look like in the 21st century? What is a good society in this sense? It is a society in which all members should be able to realize their life chances or opportunities in a time of increasing exclusion and polarization of society. And so the idea now in Europe is to have this debate not only in a national context but also in a European and global context, because in a time of limited resources we cannot only talk about national concepts, but we have to talk about what is a global good society and how can we make sure that all members of the global society, of the global village, have as many opportunities as possible. This requires an alternative concept of distribution of wealth and income. This requires tackling climate change and developing a new concept of growth, not only quantitative growth but also qualitative growth, and a new understanding of life, quality of life and well-being. And it certainly requires new approaches and more efforts in global poverty reduction, just to name a few core areas. Yeah, this is basically what I wanted to discuss with you, and I look forward to our discussion afterwards. I would just like to highlight you to the next page of the handout, page 8. I will not go into detail there, but this is the result of the debates we had in German and European social democracy. How can we realize the innovation potential of social democracy again? And these are also points which are, on the one hand, very natural, like having a credible and convincing leadership and so on in a party, but it shows you also what went wrong, also in organizational terms, concerning party organization, intra-party democracy and so on, and what needs to be overcome. And another crucial point I would like to highlight out of these 7 or 8 points is that German and European social democrats are very well aware that it was a big strategic mistake to loosen the coalition with the trade unions, which happened in many European countries, especially also in Germany. So social democrats and social democratic parties have now made many efforts in trying to realign themselves with trade unions as their main and traditional allies. But this is certainly not enough, because society has changed. Trade unions have become a lot weaker, also in Europe. So social democrats need to look for new partners as well, but without neglecting the traditional trade union partners. Ja, 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.
Yeah, Dr. E is of course an expert in Germany, so he came directly to one of the core questions and dilemmas of German and also European social democracy, because indeed there were reasons why the Social Democratic Green Party government adopted these policies. I think the main reason was, on the one hand, that neoliberal policies and assumptions were so dominant at that time, at the end of 2000s, end of 90s, early 2000s, that it was very hard to find a different narrative. And also Germany was in economic crisis, had been in crisis for 10 years, more than 10 years after German unification. And almost everybody thought that it was necessary, for example, to reform the labor market, to reduce welfare state in order to free resources and to invest them in other areas like education, for example, and to reduce public debt. In my lecture I was talking about social democracy and not about Germany. So that's a very big difference. So if I talk now about Germany, then I can certainly highlight some other features of this policy. So if I talk about Germany, one can say the growth rate of Germany has increased since the so-called Agenda 2010 reforms on average. We are also able in Germany to create employment much easier, additional jobs, since the Agenda 2010 reforms have been adopted. The so-called Lohnnebenkosten, the costs for social security contributions could be lowered significantly since then. So it is cheaper for employers to hire people than it used to be before. And another thing what the Red-Green coalition did, and which even Angela Merkel, the current chancellor, now had to adopt as well, is the policy of nuclear exit, which had already been agreed under the Red-Green coalition, which Angela Merkel's government tried to reverse, to bring back nuclear energy, but which then after Fukushima she was forced to change again. So this is, I think, a positive heritage of the Red-Green coalition, at least in general terms, and it contributed to the success, the macroeconomic success Germany now enjoys, and that we could overcome the costs and burdens of German unification because of this policy easier, and Germany could come through the economic recession in a much better shape than many other European countries. But I have to complete the story. There are three reasons why social democracy suffered. One reason is that Gerhard Schröder particularly and other leading members of the party failed to explain these policies properly. That was a basic mistake. It was never really put into the context I just mentioned. It was rather announced and executed without really consulting the population. That is one reason why social democracy suffered. A second reason is just bad luck in a way. What you mentioned, the short-term horizon and the long-term horizon of people and of a democracy. So the cuts in social welfare, the hardships which were associated with these reforms went into effect immediately, and the Social Democrats were punished for it. And the benefits, the successes, were visible only 8, 9, 10 years afterwards, like now. So, but now Angela Merkel and the Conservatives are in power, and they kind of can benefit from these results. But the third reason, and this is the most crucial one, I think, these reforms have increased German competitiveness, have reduced our debt and so on, but they have also increased social polarization. Inequality has increased. It is still not going down in Germany. We have now 1.5 or 2 million people who can be called working poor, people who need to have 2, sometimes 3 jobs in order to survive. These are, we have more temp agency workers, irregular workers than we had before. And so this unemployment statistic, which has become better, needs to be looked at in different perspectives. And these conditions, these social conditions, which have not necessarily improved, that is something why many people say this is not why we have voted for the Social Democrats. We wanted a fairer and more just society. And I think this last point is the crucial one, why Germany has improved, the middle class is happier than before, but a certain part of the population not. And this is still hurting the Social Democrats. Yeah, thank you very much for your two very important questions. I think the first one on the European debt crisis. Well, first of all, I'm not an economist, and of course you have asked the $1 million question, kind of how can we fight the crisis and can Germany really play the most important role. Concerning the origins or causes of the crisis, I think there are several aspects. One aspect certainly is the over-indebtedness of southern European countries like Greece, Portugal, also Spain and Italy. And these debts and this rather lack of competitiveness of their economies has several reasons. One reason is that the administrative structure of these countries is not working. There's a high level of corruption, especially in Greece, but also in Italy we have problems in this regard. But one other area which is not discussed so often has to do with also the Agenda 2010 in some sense, with the German wage policy. Germany has had wage increases for almost 12, 13 years. They only started 3 or 4 years ago. And that made the German economy, which was already very competitive, even more competitive. And developing economies like Portugal or Greece had many problems then, even more problems to compete with Germany within the European Union. Also, the French economy has this problem now. And so the lack of coordination of wage policies, of economic policies in general in Europe has also contributed to this problem. What can one do about it? There have been in the past 2 main schools how to reform Europe and how to get rid of this crisis. And one school was the so-called austerity school, which meant these countries have to do structural reforms in their governance systems. They have to increase their tax base. They have to reduce costs, especially in the welfare area. They have to flexibilize their labor markets. The unions need to be kind of weakened in order to pursue business-friendly policies. And then we might be willing to release some of the debt of these countries. This was kind of the first phase also of the crisis and of how to deal with it. At the same time, there has always been a second school which argued that this is not enough, this is necessary in some regard, but one also needs to have more coordination in Europe concerning wage policies and tax policies, so that the European countries are not only competing with each other, which means always a race to the bottom, lower standards and so on, lower wages in order to become more competitive, but to have a thorough reform of the European economic and social policy as well. So the problem is that this austerity period was executed in a very one-sided and tough way in the last years. So there have been high social costs, especially for ordinary people, for laborers, for the vulnerable parts of society. But now I'm a bit more optimistic, I must say, because there is an increasing talk in Europe. Even Chancellor Merkel talks about it, who is called Iron Lady in the southern European countries, that one needs a policy mix. So a mix of these austerity measures on the one hand, which are needed in some regards, especially when it comes to the increase of the tax base and so on, but also to give these countries a bit more freedom, these crisis countries some more room, some more time to reform, in order to make sure that wages will not be reduced completely, that social security is still there, and to give them some additional investment and also some advice how they can create new growth engines for their economies. So that's a short answer to your big question. And second question on the Deutschmark and Ostmark, the transaction of 1-to-1, which was not done for pensions, for example, but at least for cash money and savings. That's true. That was a political decision by Helmut Kohl, former Chancellor Kohl himself. The idea was, of course, on the one hand, to make it easier for East Germans to adjust in the new society, to have more purchasing power. But also, I think he felt that it was needed that East German citizens did not feel to be only second class, to be devalued because their currency is only half in value in comparison to the Deutschmark. So it was a political, not an economic decision. But of course, in economic terms, it was a big mistake, no question about it, because it made the East German economy, which was not very competitive in any sense. It had only 1/3 of the competitiveness of the West German economy at the time of unification. It made it even less competitive, and it contributed over the first 3 to 5 years after unification to this mass unemployment we had in East Germany, and which has only very slowly come down in recent years. Thank you very much, Kamsahamnida. Well, I tried in my lecture to name a few initiatives and debates which are going on in European social democracy. I think after the imminent kind of crisis situation in the mid-2000s, when the government in Germany, in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, and in Great Britain and in France became conservative, so almost all the major powers in Europe became conservative. This has now changed, and we are seeing a consolidation of European social democracy, and in some countries, like in France, social democratic parties have come back to power. So I think in Denmark as well, for example, social democrats have overcome, I would say, the worst of the crisis and are gaining ground slowly but surely. We also, as social democrats, we have a long-term view. When you have 150 years of history, 10 years are a rather short period of time. I think in 5 to 10 years things will be better, but of course, as you also said, it does not come out of its own. We need better policies, but also another form of party organization. A party organization which makes it easier and more attractive for young people, especially, to join. And in this sense, I think there are still some problems. Of course, social democratic parties have become a bit more transparent, and they are more active in social networks, and you can be member just for a short period of time, or you can try it out and leave then without any problems. These are some initiatives, but I think concerning party reform, there needs to be done more, much more, and this is probably the task for the next 5 years especially. And but some process has been going on. For example, just to give you an example, the German social democracy has done a series of policy and organization workshops in the last, they called it workshop, it was a series of participatory events going on for more than 2 years in order to invite members, but ordinary population as well, non-members, to debate about the future of SPD. People could contribute to the election program, everybody could send in their opinions and so on. This was done for the first time, so at least there are some signs of a new openness. Your second question on FES, well, first of all, our funding, our budget comes from the parliament, the German parliament. All German political foundations, we have 6 political foundations, receive their funding from the German federal parliament. The foundations, the political foundations, do not belong to the parties. So we are not part of the SPD, we are independent, and the other political foundations as well, but we are part of the family of social democracy in Germany. But what is important is the chairman of SPD, Mr. Gabriel, he can never order us to do anything. He is never allowed to tell us what to do or what not to do. And we, on the other hand, are also not allowed to support the SPD too much. For example, in an election campaign, we are not allowed to help the SPD too much. They have to do it on their own. And there must not be any financial transactions between SPD and Friedrich Ebert Foundation. But the task of all foundations is to contribute to a pluralistic German society and democracy, and to do this in their work abroad as well. And so, of course, we try to participate in the debate about the reform of German and European social democracy. We also try to bring German politicians and international social democrats together. We are looking with our offices, like in Korea or Brazil or wherever, for reform examples which might be then applied by the SPD in Germany. But we also work together with the trade unions. This is one other partner, and also with civil society. So the SPD and other social democratic parties are not our only partners, but we have tried and we are still trying to contribute to this reform and renewal of the SPD, but with a certain independence and distance. So we are focusing more on the conceptual side and not so much on the question of party reform concerning organization and so on. This is a sovereign decision by the SPD. Yeah, thank you for your question. I think first of all, it is very difficult to compare the situation in Northeast Asia with the situation in Europe, because in Northeast Asia it is one of the few world regions where there is almost no institutional integration between the three major countries, China, South Korea and Japan. North Korea is a different story anyway. To compare this with the best integrated, the most advanced area of the world concerning regional integration, which is the European Union, is very difficult. So the bilateral or trilateral free trade agreements are very different to the internal common market in the European Union, because the common market, which is kind of the core of European integration, is a very sophisticated and decades old and always perfected kind of market, whereas a bilateral FTA is a much less mature form of economic integration. But what I said at the beginning about the deficiencies of the European integration model, I think may also be in a way relevant for the negotiations about a bilateral FTA with China, or maybe later a trilateral FTA between China, South Korea and Japan. And this is that one can learn from previous experiences that the social dimension of these free trade agreements or economic integration models has almost always been neglected. So the question of wage policies, wage competition, for example, the question about workers' rights, about the questions of co-determination of workers, of consultation at least of trade unions in the process of bargaining, negotiating about these agreements. This has been neglected in the past in other regions of the world as well, and especially when you deal with a country like China, which does not observe major human rights, major workers' rights, and does not observe most of the core labor standards as identified by the ILO. I think one needs to be very careful that such a free trade agreement does not lead to a deterioration of conditions for workers here in South Korea. On the other hand, to put it positively, I'm not basically against a free trade agreement. I think it's just how you design it, how you negotiate it, that matters, and you might also be able to use it in a positive fashion, because despite all the problems here in South Korea concerning working conditions and rights for trade unions and so on, it's of course much better than in China. So an FTA might also put pressure on a country like China to improve their labor conditions, to increase quality of goods and of services, to apply new standards of quality for the goods they produce and for agricultural products, which would also increase the prices in China and so make competition between South Korean and Chinese companies a bit more fair than it is currently, because currently Chinese companies certainly can realize advantages in trade because they are cheap. They are not necessarily good, but they are cheap, and this might maybe, if you negotiate a free trade agreement in a sensible way, might improve. Well, first of all, thank you very much also for your interest and your attention. It was a great pleasure to be here with you and to receive your questions as well and to discuss them with you. Well, I just want to say, despite I try to paint a rather realistic picture of European and German social democracy, but I'm certainly not a pessimist. I think that over time progressives will have good opportunities in Europe and maybe also, I hope so, in Korea in the next years to come. And I heard, and we discussed a bit before the lecture, that the Progressive Justice Party is in a process of reform, and for this I wish you best of luck. I think not only this party but also the big opposition party, the Minjudang, has to reform, and I hope that the problems which were visible on the progressive side or liberal progressive side in the last year's election, especially in the presidential election campaign, that this can be overcome. As Friedrich Ebert Foundation, if you want further information on Germany, on social democracy, we are always happy to provide you with this information. We also brought some materials on social democracy and so on. We will give you after the lecture. And with this, thank you again very much, and it would be nice to stay in touch. Kamsahamnida.